The call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. "Mrs. Chen, this is Marcus from Riverside Funeral Home. I'm calling about your husband's ashes. There's been a situation." My blood turned to ice. David had been gone for 3 months, and I'd been meticulously planning his memorial service for the following weekend. Every detail had been carefully arranged, from the memorial garden where we'd scatter his ashes to the playlist of his favorite jazz standards. What situation could there possibly be with ashes that were supposed to be safely stored at the funeral home until Saturday? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The evening before that devastating phone call had started so normally. I was sitting in my sister-in-law Margaret's pristine living room, surrounded by the usual suspects of our monthly family dinner. David's mother Helen was there, along with his brother Tom and Margaret. All of us gathered around the mahogany table that Margaret polished religiously every week. The roast chicken was perfectly golden, the wine glasses filled with Margaret's expensive Pinot Grigio, and everyone was making that careful small talk people use when they're trying to be supportive but don't quite know what to say to the widow. I had been quiet most of the evening, picking at my food and mentally reviewing my checklist for Saturday's memorial. The caterer was confirmed, the flowers ordered, the memory boards assembled with photos spanning David's 52 years. I'd even written and rewritten my eulogy 17 times, wanting every word to capture the man who'd made me laugh every single day for 23 years of marriage. The memorial garden at Willowbrook Park had been reserved, the same spot where David had proposed on a snowy December morning back in 2001. "You know, Sarah," Helen announced suddenly, her voice carrying that tone of forced cheerfulness I'd grown to dread over the past 3 months. "I've been thinking about this memorial service you're planning." She set down her wine glass with the deliberate precision of someone preparing to make an important statement. All this fuss and expense for a ceremony. David was never one for big productions. I felt my fork pause halfway to my mouth. Helen had opinions about everything, from my choice of career to the color I'd painted our kitchen, but she'd been surprisingly quiet about the memorial arrangements until now. "The service isn't fussy," I said carefully. "It's exactly what David and I discussed. He wanted something meaningful, somewhere beautiful." "Oh, I know you think you're honoring him," Helen continued, waving her hand dismissively, "but I've taken care of everything. You don't need to worry about those ashes anymore." The way she said "those ashes" made my stomach clench. She spoke about David's remains, the same way she might discuss disposing of old newspapers. "What do you mean, taken care of everything?" I asked, though every instinct I had was screaming that I didn't want to hear the answer. Helen beamed with the satisfaction of someone who believed they'd solved a complicated problem. "Well, while you were away at that grief counseling retreat last weekend, I went to Riverside Funeral Home. I have David's emergency contact information from when he was in the hospital, so they let me handle things. I told them we didn't need to keep the ashes anymore, that the family had decided on a simpler approach." The room seemed to tilt slightly. Margaret stopped cutting her chicken. Tom's fork clinked against his plate as he set it down. "Mom," Tom said slowly, "what exactly did you do?" "I did what needed to be done," Helen replied, clearly mistaking our stunned silence for gratitude. "I found a lovely service that handles these things properly. They came and picked up the ashes yesterday morning. Clean, efficient, no mess, no fuss. They handle everything for families who don't want to deal with the complications of memorials and ceremonies." "You had David's ashes picked up?" I asked, my voice sounding strange and distant even to my own ears. "Picked up by whom?" "A disposal service," Helen said matter-of-factly. "They specialize in helping families move forward after loss. Much more practical than all this memorial planning you've been obsessing over. They gave me a very reasonable rate, and I thought you could use the money you've been spending on flowers and catering for something more useful. Maybe finally replace that old car of yours." I stared at her across the table, trying to process what she was telling me. "You sold David's ashes to a disposal service?" "Not sold, dear. I paid them to handle the situation properly. It cost $200, which I thought was quite reasonable, considering they took care of everything. No more storage fees at the funeral home, no more of this expensive memorial nonsense. David is at peace now. and you can focus on moving forward with your life instead of dwelling in the past." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in Margaret's hallway. Tom was staring at his mother with an expression I'd never seen before, something between horror and disbelief. Margaret had gone completely pale, one hand pressed to her mouth. "Helen," I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the fact that my entire world had just collapsed. "What was the name of this disposal service?" "Budget Memorial Solutions," she said proudly. "They have excellent reviews online, very professional, very discreet. They handle all sorts of situations for families who need to move forward practically, rather than getting caught up in emotional displays." I pulled out my phone with trembling fingers and searched for Budget Memorial Solutions. What I found made my blood run cold. It wasn't a legitimate memorial service at all. It was a scrap metal operation that advertised, quote, "cash for cremation urns and memorial medals." Their website showed pictures of melted down brass urns, silver memorial plaques, and gold-plated keepsakes, all reduced to raw materials and sold by weight to metal refineries. "Helen," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "this isn't a memorial service. This is a scrap metal dealer." "Don't be ridiculous," Helen huffed, but I could see uncertainty creeping into her eyes. They had official letterhead. They knew exactly what they were doing. I turned my phone toward her, showing the website. "They buy cremation urns and memorial items to melt down for scrap metal. They don't handle remains with dignity. They strip the valuable metals and dispose of everything else as waste." Tom leaned over to look at my phone, his face growing ashen. "Mom, please tell me you didn't actually give them Dad's ashes." The man was very professional, Helen said defensively, but her voice was starting to waver. "He explained that they would handle everything respectfully. He said many families choose this option when they want to move forward practically." "What exactly did you give them?" I asked, though I was terrified of the answer. "Just the urn and whatever was inside it," Helen stammered. "The funeral home said everything was ready for pickup. I signed the paperwork as next of kin." Margaret finally found her voice. "Helen, you gave them David's actual ashes? His cremated remains?" "Well, yes, but the man assured me they would handle everything appropriately. He said they work with families all the time who don't want the burden of keeping urns around the house." I felt like I was going to be sick. "Helen, that urn was handcrafted walnut with brass inlays. David and I chose it together 2 years ago when we were pre-planning our arrangements. But more importantly, those weren't just ashes to be disposed of. Those were David's remains. His actual body." "I know what cremation is, dear," Helen said sharply, but I could see her hands starting to shake. "Do you?" I asked. Standing up so suddenly, my chair scraped against Margaret's hardwood floor. "Do you understand that David's body was cremated, and those ashes are literally all that's left of him physically in this world? Do you comprehend that you just sold my husband's remains to strangers who melt down urns for profit?" "They said they would scatter the ashes in a memorial garden," Helen whispered, but even she didn't sound convinced anymore. "Their website says they dispose of non-valuable organic materials in accordance with local waste management regulations," I read directly from my phone. "That means they threw David in a dumpster after they took apart his urn." Tom stood up abruptly, his chair clattering backward. "Mom, how could you do this? How could you make this decision without asking Sarah?" "I was helping," Helen said, tears starting to form in her eyes. "Sarah has been so obsessed with this memorial, spending all that money, planning everything down to the smallest detail. I thought if I took care of the ashes situation, she could focus on healing instead of dwelling." "Dwelling?" I repeated, my voice rising despite my best efforts to stay calm. "I was planning a memorial service for my husband. I was honoring the man I loved for half my life. I was doing exactly what David and I planned together." "But all that expense," Helen protested weakly. "All that elaborate planning. David was a simple man. David was a history professor who spent his entire career preserving the past for future generations," I said. feeling a strange calm settle over me as the full magnitude of her betrayal became clear. He believed that remembering and honoring people properly was one of the most important things we do as human beings. He wrote his master's thesis on funeral customs throughout history. He taught courses on how different cultures honor their dead. Helen's face went completely white. He never told me that. Because you never asked, I said simply. In 23 years of family dinners, you never once asked David about his work, his research, or what was important to him. You complained that his job was boring, that he spent too much time with old books and dead people. Margaret found her voice again. Sarah, surely we can fix this. We can call them, explain the mistake. I was already dialing the number from the website. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. Budget Memorial Solutions, we're closed. This is Sarah Chen, I said. You picked up cremation remains from my mother-in-law yesterday. I need to know exactly what happened to them. Lady, we don't discuss specific transactions over the phone. You got questions, you come in during business hours. Sir, those were my husband's ashes, his actual cremated remains. There's been a terrible mistake. The man's tone shifted slightly. Look, we get this call sometimes. Family members who didn't know about the disposal. The old lady signed all the paperwork. Said she was authorized. We operated completely within the law. What did you do with the remains? I asked, though I was dreading the answer. The urn was nice quality walnut and brass. We got good money for the metal components. The organic material was disposed of according to county regulations. Disposed of how? I pressed. Same way all organic waste gets handled. Look, lady, I'm sorry for your loss, but this isn't our fault. Your family member hired us to handle disposal, we handled disposal. The line went dead. I stared at my phone for a long moment before looking up at Helen, who was now crying openly. They melted down David's urn for scrap metal and threw his ashes away with the garbage. Tom sank back into his chair, his head in his hands. Oh God, Mom, what have you done? I didn't know, Helen sobbed. I thought I was helping. I thought Sarah was making everything too complicated. Spending too much money on fancy ceremonies when she should be moving forward with her life. Moving forward? I asked quietly. Helen, David died 3 months ago. 3 months. The memorial service was supposed to be this Saturday. I wasn't dwelling or obsessing. I was grieving my husband and planning to honor his memory the way he would have wanted. How was I supposed to know he cared about all that funeral stuff? Helen wailed. Because I tried to tell you, I said, my voice steady despite the tears streaming down my face. At Easter, when I mentioned that David and I had been researching green burial options, you changed the subject to talk about your gardening. At his birthday in April, when I brought up his thoughts on memorial traditions in different cultures, you said it was morbid to talk about death. Last Christmas, when David showed everyone his research on Victorian mourning customs, you told him he was being depressing and asked Margaret to change the topic. The room fell silent except for Helen's quiet sobs and the sound of my own heart breaking all over again. My phone rang again, and I saw it was Marcus from Riverside Funeral Home. I answered on speaker, my hands shaking. Mrs. Chen, I've been trying to reach you. We had an unauthorized pickup yesterday, and I need to discuss this situation immediately. I'm here with David's family, I said, my voice hollow. They can hear everything. Ma'am, I'm afraid there's been a serious breach of protocol. A woman claiming to be David's mother presented old hospital paperwork and convinced our new staff member to release the remains. However, our records clearly show you as the legal next of kin and the person authorized to make all decisions regarding Mr. Chen's remains. Helen looked up sharply. I am his mother. I have every right. Actually, ma'am, Marcus continued, his voice professional but firm, in the state of California, the surviving spouse has complete legal authority over funeral arrangements and remains, regardless of family relationships. Mrs. Chen is the only person authorized to make decisions about her husband's remains. What does this mean legally? Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. It means several laws have been violated, Marcus replied. Unauthorized disposal of human remains is a felony. Fraud, if false information was provided to obtain the remains. The funeral home is also investigating potential liability issues with our staff member, who released the remains without proper verification. Helen's sobbing intensified. I didn't know it was illegal. I thought as his mother I had rights. Even if you had rights, which you don't, I said quietly, you sold David's remains to scrap metal dealers. You turned my husband into garbage because you thought a memorial service was too expensive and too much trouble. Margaret finally spoke up, her voice shaking. Helen, did you even read what that company does? Did you research them at all? The man seemed so professional, Helen whispered. He said they helped families all the time. He showed me testimonials. I pulled up Budget Memorial Solutions' website again and began reading aloud. Customer testimonial. Budget Memorial helped us dispose of my father's urn after we moved to a smaller apartment. Quick, efficient, and affordable. Another one. When my mother passed, we didn't want the burden of keeping her ashes. Budget Memorial handled everything discreetly. Helen, these aren't people honoring their loved ones. These are people who view cremated remains as inconvenient clutter. I thought you felt the same way, Helen said desperately. You seemed so tired, so overwhelmed with all the planning. I thought you'd be relieved. Relieved? I stood up, pacing to Margaret's window and staring out at her perfectly manicured garden. Helen, do you know what David and I talked about the night before he went into the hospital for the last time? We sat up until 3 a.m. discussing what his memorial should look like. He told me he wanted it to be educational, something that would teach people about the history of remembrance. He wanted his favorite students to speak about how he influenced their love of learning. He wanted the memorial to be held in the Rose Garden at Willowbrook Park because that's where he proposed, where we had our anniversary picnic every year, where he felt most at peace. I turned back to face Helen, tears streaming down my face. He made me promise that his memorial would be meaningful, not just for me, but for everyone whose lives he touched. He wanted people to understand that remembering the dead properly is what separates us from animals. He wanted his death to teach people something about the value of honoring those we've lost. Sarah, Helen whispered, I'm so sorry. I didn't understand. No, you didn't understand, and you didn't try to understand, I replied. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But more than that, you actively prevented understanding. Every time David tried to share his work, his passions, his beliefs about honoring the dead, you shut him down. You called it depressing or morbid or academic nonsense. And then, when he died, you took it upon yourself to dispose of him in the most disrespectful way possible. My phone buzzed with a text message. I looked down and saw it was from Dr. Patricia Williams, David's department head at the university. Sarah, I just heard what happened. The entire history department is mobilizing. We're contacting every museum, auction house, and private collector in California. If any part of David's urn surfaces in the antique or collectibles market, we'll find it. The university is also prepared to offer a substantial reward for information leading to recovery of any remains. I read the message aloud, and Helen looked confused. Why would the university care about David's ashes? Tom answered before I could. Because Dad was respected, Mom. Because his colleagues valued him as a scholar and a human being. Because people who actually knew David understand that his remains deserve dignity and respect. The memorial service is still happening on Saturday, I announced, my voice growing stronger. David's students, his colleagues, and his friends will gather to honor his memory properly. We'll have an empty urn ceremony, where we acknowledge that his physical remains were desecrated, but his intellectual and spiritual legacy lives on. Sarah, please, Helen begged, let me help fix this. Let me help with the memorial. I looked at her for a long moment, this woman who had given birth to the man I loved but had never truly known him. Helen, you spent 30 years dismissing David's work, his interests, and his values. You sold his remains to scrap dealers because you thought honoring his memory was a waste of money. You can't fix this with apologies or good intentions. What are you saying? Tom asked quietly. I'm saying that some actions reveal fundamental character flaws that can't be overlooked or forgiven, I replied. Helen didn't make a mistake or an error in judgment. She made a series of deliberate choices based on her belief that David's wishes, my grief, and basic human decency were less important than her own opinions about what constitutes appropriate mourning. Margaret spoke up hesitantly. Sarah, she's still family. Is she? I asked. Family listens when you try to share something important. Family respects your expertise and knowledge. Family asks before making major decisions that affect you. Family understands that love means honoring what the deceased person valued, not imposing your own preferences on their memory. I gathered my purse and coat, feeling emotionally drained but strangely clear-headed. The police will be here within the hour to take statements about the unauthorized disposal of human remains. I've already contacted my attorney about civil action against Budget Memorial Solutions. The university is launching its own investigation into the desecration of a faculty member's remains. Where are you going? Margaret asked. To spend the evening writing David's eulogy, I said from the doorway. I'm going to tell everyone at the memorial exactly who he was, what he believed, and how his own mother sold his remains to scrap dealers, because she couldn't be bothered to understand or respect his life's work. As I drove home through the quiet streets of our neighborhood, I thought about David's research on Victorian mourning customs. He had always been fascinated by how different cultures honor their dead, and he would have found a bitter irony in the fact that his own remains had been treated with less dignity than ancient civilizations showed to their criminals. The house felt different when I walked in, emptier somehow, as if Helen's actions had stolen something beyond just David's physical remains. But as I sat down at David's desk to work on his eulogy, surrounded by his books on funeral customs and memorial traditions, I realized that while she had destroyed his ashes, she couldn't touch his legacy. That would live on in his students, his research, and in the memorial service that would teach everyone present about the true meaning of honoring the dead. Some losses, I understood now, were irreversible, but some victories were eternal. The next morning brought developments I hadn't expected. Detective Rivera from the Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Office called at 7 a.m. to inform me that Budget Memorial Solutions was already under investigation for multiple violations of health and safety codes related to improper disposal of human remains. Apparently, Helen wasn't their first victim. Mrs. Chen, we've discovered at least 12 other families who were defrauded by this operation in the past 6 months, Detective Rivera explained. The owner, Carl Morrison, has been targeting elderly family members and convincing them to surrender cremated remains under false pretenses. He then extracts any valuable metals from urns and memorial items before disposing of the ashes in violation of state regulations. What happens now? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer wouldn't bring David back. Morrison has been arrested on multiple felony charges, including theft, fraud, and improper disposal of human remains. We've obtained a search warrant for his facility, but I need to be honest with you, Mrs. Chen. The ashes that were disposed of 3 days ago are likely irretrievable. The county waste management facility processes organic waste immediately. I thanked Detective Rivera and hung up, feeling a mixture of vindication and profound sadness. Justice was being served, but it couldn't undo what Helen had destroyed. David's remains were gone forever, scattered among tons of garbage in a county landfill instead of resting peacefully in the memorial garden he had chosen. My phone rang again almost immediately. This time it was Dr. Williams from the university. Sarah, I have some unexpected news. One of our graduate students, Jenny Martinez, works part-time at an antique restoration shop downtown. The owner contacted her this morning about a damaged walnut urn with brass inlays that someone brought in yesterday, asking if it could be repaired and resold. My heart leaped. David's urn? Jenny recognized the craftsmanship from your description. The brass had been partially stripped, but the wood was intact. More importantly, Sarah, there were still cremated remains inside. It appears Morrison only removed the valuable metal components and abandoned the urn when he realized the wood wasn't worth much. I sat down heavily, overwhelmed by this unexpected development. David's ashes are safe? About 60% of them, according to Jenny's estimate. It's not everything, but it's David. The antique dealer, Robert Kim, is a colleague of David's from his research on Asian American burial customs. When he realized what had happened, he immediately secured the urn and contacted the university. He refuses to accept any payment for his role in recovering David's remains. Quote, "Tears of relief streamed down my face. After accepting that David was truly gone forever, this news felt like a miracle. Can I pick up the urn today?" Robert is personally delivering it to Riverside Funeral Home this afternoon. Marcus has already prepared proper storage, and they're treating this as a priority restoration of dignity case. The urn will be ready for Saturday's memorial service. After ending the call, I realized I needed to update David's family about this development. I called Tom first, knowing he would handle informing Margaret. But when it came to Helen, I hesitated. Her actions had caused immeasurable pain, and while some of David's remains had been recovered, nothing could excuse or undo what she had done. Tom answered on the first ring. "Sarah, I've been awake all night thinking about everything. I need you to know that Margaret and I completely support whatever legal action you decide to take. Mom's behavior was inexcusable." "Tom, there's been a development," I said, and explained about the partial recovery of David's ashes. His relief was audible through the phone. "This is incredible news," he said. "Does Mom know?" "I'm not sure I want to tell her," I admitted. "Tom, I've been thinking about forgiveness and family relationships all night. What Helen did wasn't just a mistake in judgment. It revealed something fundamental about how she views other people's autonomy, expertise, and emotional needs." "I understand," Tom said quietly. "Margaret and I have been talking about it too. Mom has always been controlling, but we never realized how much she dismissed Dad's intellectual life until you pointed it out last night. We feel terrible that we never stood up to her when she shut down his conversations about his work." "It's not your fault," I replied, "but it does make me question whether maintaining family relationships is worth the emotional cost when someone consistently demonstrates that they don't respect basic boundaries or human dignity." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that Helen will not be welcome at David's memorial service on Saturday. She sold his remains to scrap dealers because she thought honoring his memory was wasteful and foolish. She doesn't deserve to participate in the ceremony that celebrates everything she spent years dismissing." Tom was quiet for a long moment. "Sarah, I think you're right." "Margaret agrees. We'll attend the service to honor Dad, but we won't bring Mom or even tell her the details about when and where it's happening." Saturday morning arrived with perfect weather, the kind of clear, bright day that David had always loved. The memorial garden at Willowbrook Park was filled with over 200 people, far more than I had anticipated. David's students, both current and former, had traveled from across the country. His academic colleagues from universities throughout California were there, along with neighbors, friends, and people whose lives David had touched, in ways I was still discovering. Dr. Williams opened the ceremony by speaking about David's contributions to historical scholarship and his dedication to teaching. She announced that the university was establishing the David Chen Memorial Fund for Historical Preservation, ensuring that his passion for honoring the past would continue to benefit future generations of students. When it was my turn to speak, I stood at the podium holding the restored urn, looking out at the sea of faces that represented David's true legacy. 3 days ago, I began, someone who claimed to love David sold his cremated remains to scrap metal dealers. That person dismissed his life's work as academic nonsense, his beliefs about honoring the dead as morbid obsession, and his memorial service as wasteful extravagance. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Many people had heard rumors about what happened, but this was the first time I had spoken publicly about Helen's actions. But standing here today, surrounded by the people who truly knew David, I realized that no one can destroy what really matters. His remains were treated as garbage by someone who never bothered to understand his work or respect his values. However, his ideas, his teaching, his research, and his influence on all of you will outlive any physical memorial. I gestured to the crowd. This is David's real legacy. Not the ashes in this urn, but the knowledge he shared, the students he inspired, the historical preservation projects he supported, and the understanding he fostered about why remembering the dead matters to the living. As I scattered David's recovered ashes in the rose garden where he had proposed 24 years earlier, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. Helen's actions had caused tremendous pain, but they had also revealed the depth of love and respect that David's chosen family, his intellectual community, felt for him. After the ceremony, as people shared memories and stories about David's impact on their lives, I realized that forgiveness and reconciliation weren't always the highest values. Sometimes, protecting yourself from people who consistently demonstrate disrespect and harmful behavior was the more loving choice, both for yourself and for the memory of those you're trying to honor. Helen never learned about the memorial service, never saw the hundreds of people who gathered to celebrate David's life, never heard the stories about his influence on students and colleagues. She had chosen ignorance and control over understanding and respect, and now she would live with the consequences of that choice. Some relationships, I understood now, were worth fighting for. Others were worth walking away from. The difference lay in whether the other person was capable of growth, understanding, and genuine remorse, or whether they would continue making the same harmful choices while expecting forgiveness without change. As I drove home that evening, the empty urn beside me on the passenger seat, I felt something I hadn't experienced since David's death: peace. Not the peace of resolution or reconciliation, but the peace that comes from honoring what deserves honor and protecting what deserves protection, even if it means accepting that some losses are permanent. 6 months later, I received a call that would change everything I thought I knew about justice and closure. It was Attorney General Patricia Nakamura's office, informing me that Carl Morrison's case had uncovered a statewide network of fraudulent memorial services targeting grieving families. The investigation had expanded far beyond budget memorial solutions, revealing a systematic exploitation of people at their most vulnerable moments. Mrs. Chen, your case became the catalyst for comprehensive legislation protecting families from memorial fraud, Attorney General Nakamura explained during our phone conversation. The David Chen Memorial Protection Act will require all businesses handling human remains to undergo rigorous licensing, background checks, and regular inspections. Your husband's story has literally saved hundreds of other families from experiencing what you went through. I sat in David's study, surrounded by his books on historical preservation and funeral customs, absorbing the irony that his desecrated remains had led to legislation protecting the dignity of the dead. David would have appreciated the historical significance of his own case, becoming a turning point in how society protects grieving families from predators. There's something else, the Attorney General continued. Morrison has agreed to a plea bargain that includes full restitution to all affected families and cooperation in identifying his network of associates. He's also agreed to publicly document his methods as part of an educational campaign warning families about memorial fraud. The financial restitution was substantial, but money couldn't restore what had been lost. What mattered more was knowing that other families would be protected from experiencing the violation and betrayal that Helen's actions had enabled. Over those 6 months, the dynamics within David's family had shifted dramatically. Tom and Margaret had made genuine efforts to understand David's work and my grief process. They attended lectures at the university about historical preservation, read David's published papers, and even volunteered with the memorial fund established in his name. Their transformation felt authentic, born from genuine remorse, and a desire to honor the brother and brother-in-law they now realized they had never truly known. Helen, however, remained unchanged. She had moved to Arizona to live with her sister, claiming that the family drama in California had become too stressful for her health. She continued to maintain that her actions had been well-intentioned, that she had been trying to help me move forward with my life, and that everyone was overreacting to what she called an unfortunate misunderstanding. Tom had shared some of her messages with me, seeking guidance on how to respond. She keeps saying she was just trying to help, he had told me during one of our monthly coffee meetings. She acts like we're all being unfair by holding her accountable for something she claims she didn't understand was wrong. That's exactly the problem, I had replied. Helen still doesn't understand that her intentions don't excuse the impact of her actions. She's more concerned with defending her self-image as a helpful person than with acknowledging the harm she caused or making amends. The memorial fund had grown beyond anything I had imagined possible. Donations came from historians, educators, former students, and complete strangers who had been moved by David's story. The fund now supported graduate student research, historical preservation projects, and educational programs about respectful end-of-life practices. David's legacy had expanded, from touching hundreds of students to influencing thousands of people across multiple fields of study. Jenny Martinez, the graduate student who had recognized David's urn at the antique shop, had become the fund's first recipient. Her research project on cultural attitudes toward death and remembrance was directly inspired by David's work and the circumstances of his case. She often told people that studying how David's own death had been handled taught her more about the importance of dignified memorial practices than any textbook could have conveyed. Dr. Williams had asked me to speak at the university's annual symposium on death studies, and I had initially declined. The thought of publicly discussing Helen's betrayal and its aftermath felt too raw, too personal to share with strangers. But as the months passed and I witnessed the positive changes that had emerged from David's story, I began to reconsider. When I finally agreed to speak, the auditorium was packed with students, faculty, and community members. I stood at the podium where David had delivered countless lectures, looking out at faces eager to understand how personal tragedy could transform into meaningful social change. My husband David dedicated his career to studying how different cultures honor their dead, I began. He believed that the way a society treats death reveals fundamental truths about its values, priorities, and humanity. He could never have imagined that his own death would become a case study in both the worst and best of human behavior. I spoke about Helen's actions not with bitterness but with clinical detachment, explaining how her dismissal of David's expertise and her unauthorized disposal of his remains had violated every principle he had spent his career advocating. I described the legal and legislative changes that had resulted from the case, the educational initiatives funded by his memorial fund, and the countless families who would be protected from similar exploitation in the future. The most profound lesson from David's story, I concluded, is that sometimes the greatest honor we can give to the dead is to ensure that their suffering serves a purpose for the living. David's remains were treated as garbage by someone who claimed to love him, but his story has become a beacon, protecting other families from experiencing the same violation. The audience's response was overwhelming. Students approached me afterward with stories of their own family conflicts around death and memorial practices. Faculty members shared research ideas inspired by David's case. Community members asked how they could support the memorial fund or volunteer with educational programs about end-of-life dignity. But the most meaningful response came from an elderly woman named Rosa Gutierrez, who waited until everyone else had left before approaching me. "My daughter almost fell for one of these scam companies last month," she told me, with tears in her eyes. "She saw your husband's story on the news and recognized the same tactics. Your pain saved my husband's ashes from being desecrated." Walking home that evening, I reflected on the strange journey from devastating betrayal to meaningful purpose. Helen's actions had been unforgivable, motivated by her own need for control rather than any genuine concern for my well-being. She had stolen David's remains and sold them to criminals because she valued her own opinions over my expertise, my grief, and basic human decency. Yet from that profound violation had emerged something David would have treasured: real, lasting change that protected vulnerable people from predators. His story had become larger than his individual tragedy, transforming into a force for justice and education that would outlive both of us. I never spoke to Helen again after that dinner at Margaret's house. She had made several attempts to contact me through Tom and Margaret, usually around holidays or the anniversary of David's death. Her messages followed a predictable pattern: brief acknowledgments that things went wrong, followed by lengthy justifications of her intentions and suggestions that enough time had passed for us to, quote, move forward as a family. Tom had eventually stopped passing along her messages, understanding that Helen's version of reconciliation required me to ignore her fundamental character flaws and pretend that her actions hadn't revealed deep-seated problems with respect, boundaries, and basic human empathy. Some relationships, we had both learned, weren't worth preserving when the other person refused to acknowledge wrongdoing or demonstrate genuine change. The second anniversary of David's death approached with less dread than I had anticipated. The memorial garden at Willowbrook Park had become a place of peace rather than pain, where I could sit among the roses and remember David as he had lived, rather than focusing on how his death had been mishandled. The restored urn sat on the mantel in our living room, no longer a reminder of violation, but a symbol of recovery and resilience. I had begun dating again, something that would have seemed impossible during those first devastating months. Michael was a colleague of David's from the anthropology department, a widower who understood both grief and the importance of honoring the past while building toward the future. He had known David professionally and respected his work, which made it easier to share memories and stories without feeling like I was betraying either man's memory. The David Chen Memorial Protection Act had passed unanimously in both houses of the state legislature, with several other states introducing similar legislation. The law required licensing for all businesses handling human remains, established criminal penalties for memorial fraud, and created victim support services for families affected by such crimes. David's name would be permanently associated with protecting the dignity of the dead and supporting the rights of grieving families. On the morning of the second anniversary, I visited David's memorial garden early, before the usual joggers and dog walkers arrived. The roses were in full bloom, their fragrance filling the morning air with the same sweetness that had surrounded us on our wedding day 24 years earlier. I sat on the bench where David had proposed, thinking about the journey from that moment of pure joy to this complex mixture of loss, growth, and hard-earned wisdom. Helen's betrayal had taught me that forgiveness and reconciliation weren't always virtuous choices. Sometimes the most loving action was protecting yourself and others from people who consistently demonstrated harmful behavior patterns. Sometimes justice meant accepting that certain relationships were irreparable and focusing your energy on connections that honored mutual respect and genuine care. But more importantly, David's story had taught me that even the most profound violations could be transformed into forces for positive change. His desecrated remains had become the foundation for legislation protecting thousands of families. His stolen memorial service had evolved into an ongoing educational legacy that would influence how society approaches death and remembrance for generations to come. As I stood to leave the garden, I noticed a young couple walking slowly along the path, holding hands and speaking in hushed, reverent tones. They paused at David's memorial plaque, reading about his contributions to historical preservation and the circumstances that had led to the memorial protection legislation. The woman wiped away tears, and I realized they were probably planning their own end-of-life arrangements, seeking guidance about how to protect their final wishes from potential family interference. David's story was still teaching people, still protecting families, still honoring the fundamental human dignity he had spent his career defending. Helen's attempt to erase his legacy had instead amplified it beyond anything we could have imagined during his lifetime. Some victories, I understood now, were worth the price of permanent loss. Some battles were worth fighting even when reconciliation became impossible. And sometimes the greatest tribute to someone's memory was ensuring that their suffering served a purpose larger than individual grief. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.